All right, folks, so we could go in on the afternoon program. We have a nice little flow here from the last session. We have Risa Brooks and Clark McCauley with us, both of which I'm very pleased to say are non-resident fellow with Trends. Get the plug in. But Risa's going to carry on, I think, to a degree from the last panel about sort of the threat from Daesh. Is it unique or exceptional? And then Clark's going to tell us what comes next. So very much looking forward to this.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody can stay awake after lunch. I'm trying to. I'm talking, so that will help. I want to tell you a bit about what I aim to do in the next 20 minutes. Rather than present a specific piece of research, what my goal is to step back and kind of think about some of the themes that we've been talking about the last day and a half, and integrate that with some of the ideas that I brought when I came here. And so it's kind of a big picture, big think kind of reflection. And you'll see some of my own ideas in there. And in that spirit, last night as I was refining what I was going to say today, I actually went back and cheated and put some of the things I learned into my slides. So a few of you will see some of your names on my slides. So, and I might say some other things about things I learned today. So with that, let me go ahead and start. This is the question that I was puzzling about when I first started thinking about what I would do here at the conference. And that was trying to think about whether this phenomenon of ISIS is something qualitatively different than anything else we've seen before. Is this a difference in degree in terms of the capabilities and opportunities that ISIS has, or is it a difference in kind, that there's something different in the phenomenon of this group? How much, and I think we haven't thought about this as much as we should, how much is what ISIS brings to the table a result of just the sort of environment in which it's operating versus something intrinsic to the organization? And then if it is different, why is that? Okay, so the way that I'm going to approach this is to just sort of start out on a meta level, thinking about sort of the politics of the organization, what are its goals, what is the nature of the organization, what are its methods, and sort of move through the analysis that way. So this is the first sort of thing to think about. You know, when we're first struck with, and sort of the inspiration for this topic came from my sense of my own reading and sense that many people view ISIS as something really starkly different and sort of mystify it as a result. And I started to think, well, is this group really different? Now it's transnational, it's revolutionary, as we heard yesterday, and I was quite taken with that. I thought that was really useful. And people think of it as sort of challenging the world order. But this is certainly not the first group that's challenged the Westphalian state system, right? There are other movements, transnational movements, that did not see themselves as bound by regular state borders. And, you know, when we put them in that context, we start to think of them as far less exceptional in that regard. They're also territorial. In fact, that renders them much more like other insurgent groups than most of than Al-Qaeda, for example. It's much more familiar in that way. It also engages in state building, and that's old school insurgency activity. There's any variety of them that do many of the things that ISIS does. So I don't see a lot of anything too exceptional in that pure respect. What about its strategy of armed conflict? And I'll say a little bit more about this. You know, as we all know, the sort of methods of the strategy of what ISIS is trying to accomplish with its use of violent tactics, there's a variety of different things, right? We've talked a lot about the insurgent aspects of that. But we also see, you know, this sort of traditional use of terrorism in Paris, in Brussels, aimed at sort of attacking and provoking a response, provoking an overreaction, gaining adherence as a result. And, you know, I think that none of this is either new as well. The hybrid nature of the organization, there's been lots of groups that have used, including Hezbollah most recently, as the Israelis well know, use conventional terrorism strategies combined with insurgency. So there's nothing especially new about that as well. Here I think we get into something a little more interesting. The ideology. I think what makes ISIS distinctive to many people is not necessarily the content of the ideas that they expound upon, but that the way that they've been able to integrate their political and military requirements with those ideas in a pretty seamless fashion. And that the skill with which that's been done, which is quite a deliberate strategic effort, I think is pretty exceptional. Again, though, this isn't necessarily something that we've not seen before. We've seen many efforts by organizations. Marxist-Leninist has a whole theory of action, right, built into the ideology that's integrated. That's not a new phenomenon either. And other groups have integrated religious practice into their goals and into their actions as well. Shinrikyo is a notable case of that. Some of the things I think that we fail to appreciate about the organization, however, is the degree to which, so part of the fixation on this being exceptional is that we think about it as empowering the sort of ideological basis of the group. But it's also really constraining, and this is also similar to other groups, that a lot of its authority depends upon its ability to win, to continue to advance control of territory, and we heard from Lhasa and John separately about the decline in fighters being drawn to the region in Denmark and the United States, and that's an inherent problem in the ideology, right? In that if they can't demonstrate that their ability to acquire and hold territory, it's delegitimating the fundamental ideas of the organization, and one wonders whether the sort of recent territorial losses are actually tied to that at all. And I'm curious, I would be interested to hear what you think, if that has anything to do with it. They just seem less efficacious, which is an indictment of their very ideology, right? Also the apocalypse, and the extent, as I understand it, that's part of the sort of ideas and symbols that are deployed by the organization, that really requires that the adversary do things to fulfill that vision, right? That's about confrontation with the West, so everything, the West and other regional governments, so everything that's being done can be played into that ideology. And I think that point we need to really reflect upon, because the actions that we as outsiders take can really reinforce the sort of power of that idea of the apocalypse, and sort of keep that in mind as we're thinking about choices and actions, military actions in particular. Also, the other thing is that the social welfare aspects of what they're trying to do, and we got into this a bit yesterday, that's part of the ideas. That's not just part of state building. That's a core tenet, a core thing they're advancing, as I understand, in their propaganda. And that's difficult to do, as we also talked about. So are there contradictions, are there tensions there that we don't appreciate, but that might be similar in some ways to other militant groups? Let's talk about their tactics a bit. And then I'm going to talk about the organization as well after that. So we tend to get caught up with the event in the moment and, thinking, okay, this organization is now turning from the region to Europe, to Tunisia, to Beirut, to Kuwait, and is now thinking outside its sort of core zone, is now going to be engaging in a massive terrorist campaign using traditional terrorist strategies. And I think that the evidence is really against that. If you start to think about what we call in social science a counterfactual, like what would the world look like if we changed something, took something out of the picture. Now, the counterfactual here is this group has a lot of capacity and a lot of opportunity. If it was really investing in terror campaigns, it would be doing a lot more than it is. And then when we start to reflect on even Paris and Brussels, and we look at the network that was involved there, what we see is that we think of this as such an efficacious act. It's horrific. Many people died. But there were quite a lot of errors in the execution, especially of the Paris attacks. And from what the information that I'm familiar with and I know is that the main sort of planner of those attacks was somebody that wasn't especially highly regarded in the organization. Right? He's a guy that went to Syria. He was involved in some different units, one of them high profile, but was not a name that was especially well known, not a leader of the organization, not especially strategically wise individual, a pretty good opportunist that took advantage of some big gaps in law enforcement and the like. And what does that tell us? That suggests that if this group was really focusing on attacks in Europe or elsewhere, that they would be hiring Muhammad Atta, not hiring Abdel Hamid Aboud, right? So we need to sort of think about that. And I think that here, as many people know, there's a big difference between the al-Qaeda emphasis, right, which was much more geared toward high-intensity spectaculars, especially early on, in order to generate a lot of terror. So they're much more about sort of mayhem and dislocation, I would say, than about sort of terrorism. And in that way, they look more like a conventional insurgency as well. Let's talk a bit about the sort of organizational features of the group and the sort of strategic acuity of its leaders, which is something that I think is especially notable and something that really came out in some of the themes that we had yesterday. Just a couple of examples. I put some up there from yesterday's discussion from Craig Whiteside talking about sort of the selective targeting of awakening leaders, the sort of use of co-optation, singling out of individuals, doing this as early as 2007, 2008, showing premeditation. That's remarkable strategic acuity, right? Some of the other things that we heard from Charlie Winter, I think I put you Winters, it should be Winter, I know, I'm sorry. The timing of the propaganda videos after the Pledges of Allegiance, that's a very well premeditated activity. Also, the sort of listening to Mia this morning, the use of children and thinking about the strategic role of that. Why does that matter? And one of the ways that it matters is not just sort of propaganda, not sort of demonstration of brutality, which was part of sort of the messaging there, but also that there's a strategic value to that. Because what is our reaction? I can speak about my own personal reaction, which is, wow, this really just changes things. This is horrifying. I have a 7 and 11-year-old. This is terrible, right? And what does that inspire, that deep appeal, that natural sense of humanity? It inspires a desire to act. What does ISIS want us to do? It wants us to act without reflexively, right? So that may be, and the fact that it's in the online messaging, which is how I understand it, I don't know if it's in the offline stuff as much, suggests that maybe there's strategic thinking there. And so reflecting on the organization, and this is where I would say the biggest gap in our understanding today is thinking about this sort of how the leadership, this very hierarchical, stable leadership, has been able to, is anticipating and thinking about what we're going to do. Even if you look at the timing of the attack in Ningwa province, originally June 2014, this is in the middle of an election, right? Where the U.S. has a real investment in who is going to, if Abdi is going to be able to make a government, right? There's lots of strategic thinking that we're not appreciating. The talent spotting that was discussed this morning, sort of the systematic use of children, the use, all of those things. I think there are many, many examples. And as Joel Day talked about, this sort of cultivating of affiliates and how that's done. The thing that I think we don't think about, and we need to be cautious of not getting so being aware of the strategic nature of this organization, is also realizing that most organizations split and divide, and they do over a period of time for any number of reasons. And we see this among the most disciplined. And we need to be anticipating that and paying attention. And the sort of part, if I was sitting in a room with any authority to tell anybody what to think about, I would be saying, and hopefully we are doing this in the United States and elsewhere, paying attention to sort of what intelligence we can get about potential schisms within the organization and how to think about exploiting those, you know, within sort of messaging, within sort of other activities. Okay, I want to go to one more set of issues, and here I'll go into a little more detail, a little more complexity than my other comments have been so far. Talking about the capabilities of the organization. Now, does this render them exceptional? Is this what makes ISIS unique? It's so capable and different in that way. And I want to talk about the sanctuaries in terms of capabilities, in terms of sanctuaries and what ISIS has. And sort of propose to you first a way of thinking about a sanctuary and then talk about what we know about what they have, which we know some of that, but to sort of think about it slightly in a more comprehensive way. So when we think about a sanctuary, what we're really talking about is security, right? Security for some subset of activities that a militant group wishes to engage in. And there's different kinds of sanctuaries, different ways that they achieve security, and one of them is by thinking territorially, controlling a piece of territory, either because there's a vacuum of state authority or because there's complicity from a state, right, in some part of the country. Or the alternative is to talk about or think about a community sanctuary, which is an area where you don't have physical control, but in which a population is sympathetic or ambivalent or sort of ignorant of what's going on in its population, mostly complicit, and that there's some ability to obtain security as a result of that. The other dimension of that is these things can be remote versus local to the area of operations. And let me say what I mean by that. We always think of when we think of Al-Qaeda pre-2001, we think of this territorial sanctuary in Afghanistan. And because of that, because it's so distant, it's sort of remote physically, logistically, right? There's a big ocean. But there's other ways to make a sanctuary remote, and this is sort of part of something I think we need to think about more, which is to create a security obstacle to prevent movement between the sanctuary and the area of the attacks. And that's what's lacking with Europe, right, with the porous borders, is you can move from the territory in the region in and out of Europe easily, and one of the big advantages that the United States has. The reason these things are important is because they confer particular advantages. And this is my busiest slide for the day. So what are the advantages? I'll unpack this and give us a couple minutes on this one. So first of all, this sort of notion of a remote territorial sanctuary. Think about, again, to use the one that we'll all have in our minds, Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda pre-2001. What does that afford a group? It affords a lot of ability to do organizational capacity, specialization. We saw that with the sort of big org chart that Charlie Winter showed us with ISIS in Iraq and Syria being able to develop a specialized organization, develop organizational capacity. It allows for much better human resource management. If you look back at the choosing of the hijackers prior to 9/11, you see that there's vetting. It's not just, it's a systematic process, and then indoctrination as well. The other thing it does is allow for sophistication, experimentation with manufacture of weapons, training, specialized expertise. It allows the ability to enhance financing through extortion, taxation systems, criminal systems, things like that. What it doesn't do is allow for tactical direction in the area of operations, right? There's a separation, and strategically there can be direction and guidance, but it's actually not control in the area of operations. The shaded areas there are the synergies between local, community, and remote territorial sanctuary, in case you're sort of wondering what those are. a local sanctuary does different things. It lets you actually communicate, hide, gather intelligence about your local environment. It allows you operational security, which is very important if you're trying to engage in some coordinated action. And it allows for some coercion, maybe some assistance from the local population in financing, but that's much more limited. What's important is the way that you get synergies across those. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is that as we're thinking about this sort of movement and what it's capable of doing at this point in time, ISIS, and whether it's exceptional, I think the fact that in Europe, in parts of the region, in Tunisia, for example, that the group has been able to exploit both sort of community sanctuary and remote territorial sanctuary and benefited from those synergies is really important to understanding it. And if you've spent any time at all reading about Molenbeek, you know that this is what was going on, right? So Molenbeek, this district in Belgium, was an incredible resource for that organization, for the people who were volunteering or sort of self-volunteering to engage in violence. One of the attackers in Charlie Hebdo got his weapons there. One of the attackers in the Madrid 2004 bombings lived there formerly. The Frenchman who horrifically shot at the museum in Brussels in 2014 had associations there. At least what we know, at least 14 of the people involved in Paris and Brussels had some tie there, right? That's a remarkable phenomenon. It's actually also really a positive phenomenon in a way, right? Because what did we hear from Lasse this morning? There was a place in Denmark, one of the sort of communities you talked about, that had 32 people coming from it. And now that's been addressed, right? So you have, if you recognize, or more or less, right? Or at least that's what I took away from what you were saying. There's been progress.
You got 2 minutes, Risa.
Okay, what it suggests is that there's something that can be done about this. And that if you lessen those local community sanctuaries, that the threat and challenge that ISIS poses is a lot more limited. So a couple last things I'll say. So, is ISIS novel or exceptional? I think that if you look at sort of these different aspects, which I've done sort of briefly in an overview sense here today, I don't think it appears especially novel. Primarily, what's novel, I think, is this: the opportunities in which it operates, the place in which it operates. This is a time of remarkable social mobilization around the globe around identities. We see that in all sorts of countries, right? And that's an important context. There's this sort of post-Arab Spring moment and all of the fallout from that and the political destabilization, not to mention the Iraq 2003 war, which we still see the legacy of in Iraq and the instability there. The Iranian, the geopolitics of Iran, which nobody has really mentioned, right? That's really important in sort of the way that that's shaping competition over sectarian identities and the opportunities that that's afforded ISIS. And so I think as we think about whether it's really novel, we need to rather think about it's not necessarily the organization, but the environment in which it's emerged. Last slide. Why does any of this matter? Why does it matter whether it's new or not, or exceptional or not? And I think it gets back to some of the framing issues we talked about earlier. The more that we can have a realistic sense of what this organization can and can't do and its strengths and weaknesses without mystifying it, the better we'll be able to deflate it, right? And it's very important for public framing. It's also important for sort of making appropriate assumptions, right? And employing the right analytical frameworks and empirical metrics in evaluating the group. And I'll sort of end with this last reference to sort of the question, I think, my own question yesterday, which is, why does it matter if we view ISIS as a revolutionary group? I asked to Scott and to Craig yesterday. And I think that's because it tells us something about what it's aiming for, right? And how to counter that. It tells us how central territory and population control are going to be to the group, and how most of the emphasis is going to remain on its insurgent activity. It helps us, just to sort of make one more last reference to some of the things we learned, it helps us understand why, as Sarah told us, the recruitment of women and children is so important, and how that fits into the larger goals of building a state, and that it's not just sort of a feature of the organization, but central to it. So those are some thoughts.
I'm Clark McCauley. I'm a social psychologist, latterly a political psychologist. I guess I could say I'm a specialist in man's inhumanity to man. I've been interested in, written about genocide, about terrorism, about how normal people can do horrific things to other people. And so my first thought for this conference was to try to present something about Sofia Moskalenko and she's my colleague. Sophia and my work recently on lone wolf terrorists, and maybe especially about why Westerners are drawn to, why some Westerners are drawn to go to Syria. And then Richard here, or was it Scott? One of them, I can't remember the email now, said, well, no, that's old stuff. Plenty of people are doing that. We'd like something more general about ISIS. So, my thanks to the organizers and the sponsors here for this seminar that we've been having for now 2 days. A very good seminar, I think, in the sense that it's had an informal tone and lots of people getting their thoughts into the circulation. So I'm going to take advantage of that, plus the fact that Richard or Scott or somebody got after me about this. And so I'm going to tell you about something that I don't know anything about. Well, it's not quite true to say nothing. But I mean, I'm going to try to talk to you about not just the way a psychologist sees the conflict in Syria and Iraq, but also mostly ideas about what to do about that. Policy, for which I'm completely unprepared. But I'm going to do it because I think the question of what comes after ISIS is really important. And we haven't spent much attention on it. It's as if once we get rid of ISIS, our world is an oyster again. Kind of a contribution to the war of ideas, I suppose you could say this is. In this paper, presentation, I suggest a diplomatic initiative to describe the world we want to emerge in Syria and Iraq. I begin with a brief view of emotions and intergroup conflict, then assess the current situation in Syria and Iraq, then describe a view of the future that the U.S. could offer for discussion, and then end with some estimates of likely reactions to the initiative I describe. First thing I want to say is when I look at Syria and Iraq, I think of it as much more a matter of ethnic conflict than sectarian conflict. We tend to think that it's Sunni versus Shia, and after all, aren't these religious differences? But I think actually we'd be better off considering it an ethnic difference. And then the answer would come back, well, yes, but I mean, ISIS is Sunni, and they've been killing plenty of Sunni that they regard as insufficiently pure. So, I mean, how could it be ethnic if they're killing fellow ethnics? Well, in Northern Ireland, like 20% of the casualties were in-group casualties. Loyalists killing loyalists for various reasons, and Republicans killing Republicans for various reasons. So The fact that some members of the group were killing other members of the same ethnic group doesn't mean, for me, that it's not an ethnic conflict. So I think the Sunni versus Shia in Iraq is very little different from loyalist versus Republican. And notice I refrained from saying Catholic versus Protestant. I don't think anybody who knows anything about that conflict in Northern Ireland would say it was a conflict about religion. It was about two perceived dissent groups in conflict over power and land. So I think it's best to think about it as an ethnic conflict. And, you know, the idea of nationalism is that an ethnic group, a perceived dissent group, and its culture should have a state. Well, this was the biggest political mobilizing power of the 20th century. Some people think we've got past it. I'm trying to say I don't think we've got past it. So my first point is, I think we're better to think about it as ethnic, not sectarian, and one value that comes out of thinking about it that way is you can put other people in the same picture. You can put the Kurds, and you can put the Druze. So I think that's the first point. It's better to think about this as an ethnic conflict. And then my second point is, it's like most ethnic conflicts, it puts people up to their elbows in emotions. Now, I know that in the world we live in, the social sciences are dominated by rational choice perspectives. I know that that's what many of you probably were trained up in. So I'm going to put in a 2-minute plea here for the power of emotions in intergroup conflict, especially ethnic conflict. So my first thought about what's going on is that a majority that used to be politically subordinate, that's the Shia, have taken power from a minority that was previously dominant. That was the Sunni in Iraq. And this has big-time emotional consequences. Maybe the person who's written best about the emotional power of status reversals is Roger Peterson. And he's got a book, Intervention in the Balkans, the Strategic Use of Emotion in Conflict. I recommend it to you. I can't do justice to this idea. I can point you in this direction, but I think the issue of it is humiliation. And humiliation is, I believe, not a separate emotion. It's a combination of anger and shame. Anger at victimization and injustice, shame at failure to fight back against it. So for a long time, that majority of Shia was humiliated by the Sunni. And when the tables turned, now the Sunni are humiliated in their turn. And you know, in Syria, it was a different kind of a dominance. The minority in charge was Alawite and Christian, to be honest. And the majority were Sunni. And that was humiliating, especially when the Sunni think that their religion is the best and the only form of Islam, and that everything naturally should be subordinate to that. So big status shifts with predictable consequences of anger and shame, which together I think of as humiliation. And so that's at the bottom, for me as a psychologist, that's what's at the bottom of the Sunni-Shia conflict. But it's not only that. So the Kurds were humiliated by subordination for all of those years. And the Alawites were always worried about subordination. You know, they had their own state, briefly. So I'm trying to say ethnic conflict is rife with emotional consequences, especially associated with sudden reversals of status. And that's what I think we have to deal with to understand what's going on in Syria and Iraq. So Now I want to say a few words about what ISIS in particular, what's its situation here? Well, as we've heard several times from several different people, observers, scholars, ISIS represents the Sunni as their only answer to humiliation by Shia, this new dominant Shia in Iraq. As Charlie Winder points out, it's not just humiliation that's at issue, it's fear. They go out of their way, ISIS does, to point out that if those Shia militias ever come in and take over this area, you folks are all in deep, deep trouble. We're all in deep trouble. So it's fear as well. So for many in Iraq and Syria, ISIS is also the only source of jobs in their territory. So there's lots of people, as best I could make out reading accounts, there's lots of people sign up to fight for ISIS who have a family, a wife, and a couple of kids, and this is the only way they can make a living, basically. So there's some carrots in this, as well as potential stick of fear and humiliation. But, this ISIS protection and its ISIS jobs are currently welded together with an extremist form of Islam that many Sunni would rather do without, and even Sunni in Syria would rather do without, according to what I read. Now, and to undermine that Sunni support for ISIS, I think the U.S. must show the Sunni in Syria and Iraq a path to security from Shia humiliation that does not depend on ISIS. That is, my reading of this is, if we were to succeed against ISIS tomorrow, we'd still have a problem. Coming right after, we might be open the door to al-Nusra or something else would come to fill the gap. So here's what Denise Natali, who's been going back and forth and studying ISIS, she's at National Defense University, I believe, here's what she had to say of her February 2016 report, Countering ISIS 1 year later. Even if the U.S. defeats Daesh tomorrow, there will be a day after problem in much of Iraq and Syria. U.S. aims to stabilize Iraq and Syria should address the larger problem of weakened states and the emergence of strong, violent, non-state and sub-state actors. This effort will demand a stable set of political security arrangements that can avoid the emergence of another Daesh in the future. It should also assure that liberated areas are successful and stable so that people can return. This effort should include providing massive refugee assistance, immediate resources, humanitarian aid, developing local power sharing and security agreements, building local institutions. Now, what comes after ISIS? What would it mean to develop local power sharing and security arrangements? Building local institutions. I'm suggesting we need a diplomatic initiative that can promise at least a degree of security and status to all the major actors. This initiative would describe a world the U.S. and maybe others would like to see emerge from the current violence in Iraq and Syria, and include a statement of willingness to talk with anyone and everyone about how to reach this world. Now, what could this look like? I think security and status will be assured to the extent that each unit has its own police and court system and controls a population proportionate share of oil revenues from this combined area of Iraq and Syria. The units might initially be thought of as states and a federal government responsible for allocating water and oil resources, but other descriptions of the units are possible. You could call them provinces or departments or governorates or cantons. The U.S. will talk with any group or power about how to get to these or similar units, try to enlist allies to support the initiative. And in particular, the lines drawn in the Sykes-Picot Agreement are up for reconsideration. Now, what would this set of states look like? Well, lots of people could have different ideas about this. I'm going to give you one version so we all have something to talk about and shoot at. I think we ought to have an ISIS territory. It becomes a state of the Sunni who want ISIS governance And the U.S. would cease attacks on ISIS and cease opposing foreign volunteers for ISIS, including volunteers from the U.S. There'd be a tribal state area for Sunni who don't want ISIS governance. And there's some sheikhs who would sign up for that, I think. An Alawite state on the Mediterranean north of Lebanon, what's sometimes called Latakia, and basically the area of the French mandate for Alawites, 1920 to 1936. They actually had a state up there. Turkmen areas near the Turkish border annexed to Turkey. Kurdish state around Erbil, a Shia state around Baghdad and south, a Druze state next to Jordan, which, by the way, there was a French mandate, 1920 to 36, with a small Druze state. So it's not like this was a brand new idea. It's been there before. A Damascus federal district with police but no military, and my solution for Christians is that those who wish to emigrate will be accepted as refugees in Europe and the US. There are not enough of them, they're not well enough organized, and they're not concentrated enough to have a state. Now, what are the likely reactions to this kind of initiative? I wish Hussein Ibish were here still to tell me all of my mistakes. But here's what I'm thinking. ISIS will surely oppose the initiative because it threatens ISIS' claims to represent an international caliphate. But if ISIS keeps losing territory, it may become more ready to negotiate to save the caliphate it has remaining. At a minimum, the initiative would raise a conflict inside ISIS between power pragmatists, localists, and international Islamist radicalists, globalists. And this conflict will weaken ISIS from the inside. Do we want to save what we got, or do we insist on aiming for the whole world and losing what we've got? So that's going to produce a conflict, which would be to our advantage. Sunni who do and do not want ISIS will be put in conflict. The awakening showed the potential power of this conflict, which will weaken ISIS from the outside. Tehran will likely oppose such an initiative because any movement toward a peaceful solution would reduce Iran's influence in Iraq and Syria. Hezbollah will likely oppose the initiative to follow Iran, even if Bashar is saved. Some Baghdad Shia may welcome the initiative as a way to reduce threat from ISIS, even at the cost of more self-determination for Sunni areas of the old Iraq. Others in Baghdad will be against any initiative that does not continue their revenge against the Sunni, who dominated the Shia for so long. This is a split already evident in reactions to Prime Minister al-Abadi's efforts to try to bring the Sunni back into the state. Moscow should welcome saving Bashar and de facto Western recognition for their Mediterranean air and sea bases in the Alawite state. Russia might welcome a division of territorial influence that can limit potential conflict between Russia and NATO armed forces. Israel will be satisfied with continued movement of Syria and Iraq from centralized states to militarily weaker federal states. The Kurds will certainly welcome recognition of their statelet. Turkey will strongly oppose recognition of current de facto Kurdish territory, but would see some sweetener in transfer of Turkoman areas to Turkey. Druze will be pleased at the prospect of recognition and some self-governance, and the Christians will feel like maybe it's their best chance to get out of town. U.S. will get credit in the Muslim world for seeking peace without Western domination and the end of the Sykes-Picot boundary. France and UK should not care. Their advantages that came out of the Sykes-Picot have long since vanished. Arab oil countries will likely oppose the initiative because it does not promise to crush ISIS, but they may be glad enough to see a limitation of Iran's power in Syria. U.S. sympathizers with ISIS will more likely go to join ISIS than attack in the U.S., not a negligible possibility, value. And refugees from Syria are likely to favor an initiative that might permit some to return. So the initiative, I think, would be PR positive for the U.S., help bring conflict into Sunni support for ISIS. It should shake up all sides by shifting the narrative from who is winning now to a conception of a future worth working for. Even opposition from Turkey, Iran, and the oil states should be tempered by a desire to avoid being seen putting self-interest above the welfare of millions who might want peace. And with this initiative, the U.S. can seize a moral high ground that brings new friends, new opportunities. So to answer my question, what comes after ISIS? The old states of Syria and Iraq have dissolved in violence. The U.S. needs, and the people suffering civil war in these areas need, a vision of how peace can emerge from violence. Unfortunately, there is currently no appetite, as I see it, in the U.S. for thinking beyond defeat of ISIS. And similarly, there was little thought for what would come after defeating Saddam Hussein. I've described one possible future in an effort to get the future in our sights. If this or a similar initiative were announced and diplomatic and material resources committed to it, notice I did not say military resources, it might indeed fail. If we don't think about what comes after ISIS, peace will surely fail.
All right, well, no doubt both two very interesting presentations and plenty to discuss. So who wants to get us going on the questions or the challenges?
Would you, on Clark's issue, it seems to me what you're talking about is actually happening, of course. Peter Galbraith has talked about splitting Iraq into three before ISIS came.
John Bolton, even, of all people,
Yeah.
said we need a Sunni state.
And it's almost certainly clear that the Kurds, they may be de jure separate, but de facto separate. They had been going back, I think it's, in the old system is extremely unlikely. And also the ceasefire, such as it is in Syria, is not a surrender, it's basically a partition. So in many respects, what you're talking about is in the cards, if not necessarily inevitable. Is this basically a matter of taking something that exists and basically stopping war, continue the same course? You're talking about sort of the near term.
Thinking that we could get some motion toward peace if most, at least, of the major actors involved in violence could see a future with some status and security. And, it's not going to be like peace is declared and all will be well and there'll be no more problems. I'm not saying that, but if we can't give people something to hope for and aim for, then I don't see how we can ever get past this kind of continuing civil war. So I'm right ready to say, I tried to put in something explicit down here so we could begin thinking about it seriously. But I'm not saying this is the only way you could think about it. But I am saying if you're not ready to think about this kind of story, well, what's your answer? Because we've got to do something better than to aim for getting rid of ISIS, like that's going to fix things. It's not going to fix things.
What might be would be a Bosnian solution. I mean, one of the things that's happened in Bosnia astoundingly is that nobody has been killed in ethnic violence since 1995, and that was not the prediction in 1995. It was the, ancient ethnic educators we had it in 12 minutes and so forth, including, I think, Peterson in some ways. But
there's still tensions and conflicts, and
right.
there's still peacekeepers and
screw-ups, crime,
yes.
all kinds.
Yes, all kinds of bad things happening.
People killing each other.
Right, or at least, now they're killing one another maybe over the drug trade or transmitting refugees or some good materialist.
The criminals get along pretty well with each other,
I thought there was some turf war over it, but
Well,
I think we're
trafficking.
But if I could just intervene on that, Risa, when you talk about how Daesh is taking advantage of novel opportunities, would sort of Clark's plan just provide another novel opportunity to continue with the violence, the death, and destruction?
Answer that question, I'll respond in a different way and use that opportunity. The point that John raised about Bosnia. So what is the way that is sort of within the normative boundaries of how most people think about the state system, which is a constraint, right? We have international law, we have normative framework of the Westphalian state system, and we have the problem of who's playing God to make those decisions to carve up the region. I think, who has the authority, the moral authority to play that role? I don't think the UN does. I certainly wouldn't want the US to be doing that. So that's fundamental. So how do you solve it within those constraints? You engage in power sharing agreements like in Bosnia, like in Northern Ireland, and you settle mostly relatively intractable conflicts through that hard work.
Those are sanctuary ideas, which was very intriguing, both the local and the larger sanctuaries. How does that fit in with Clark's plan? Because I'm interested in Richard's follow-up question, but specifically about the sanctuaries. And also the intent, the Islamic State's intent, you mentioned ideology in your talk, and how does that fit into kind of an acceptance of what John was talking about? Thank you.
You mean in terms of ISIS having its own state, or those who would sympathize with that political program having their own state?
Yes, exactly.
I mean, well, first of all, how do you square the circle between a group whose supposed ambition is transnational, that they're going to be happy within a state? That's sort of a puzzle.
I
But
think it's going to, if we were to, anybody were to make something serious out of an initiative like this, it would exacerbate what I believe are already tensions within ISIS between the localists and the globalists. I got a reference for that if you could be
No,
interested.
I'm sympathetic to that.
I didn't have to invent this distinction or this conflict, this fault line. Several people have seen it, and it would get worse if they were looking at the prospect of assuring what we've got left, as opposed to gambling all on some world Islamic plan and state. So I think it would produce some, ugly for them, okay by me, conflict within Islamic State.
I think in order to not have this be a sanctuary, even if it was secure, with secured borders, so remote from even its neighbors, you'd have to elicit some commitment that this sort of split, whoever's going to take over this proto-state is happy enough with what they've got. And so they aren't using it as a base to plan to engage in things overseas. Having said that, I do think that there is some logic to creating, to isolation and to containment in the sort of inherent in the notion of a sanctuary, right? Because what I see is the real issue for anything that's beyond sort of an inspirational, moment where somebody might do something in sympathy is that coordination, that ability to move back and forth, to have sort of coordination between something local and remote. And if you just have something remote, to use that terminology, it might be more limited.
Okay.
Good. I think we all should be very grateful to Clark for making us think a little bit outside the box.
Absolutely.
And I think it is very important, and the failures of the past to not engage in that kind of thought have been very costly. So I think in that way, I think that I see two fundamental issues. One is you rightly stress nationalism as a formative political energy in this contemporary period, and then seem to reduce it to an ethnic identity by and large. And that conflicts with what Risa was identifying as the Westphalian conception of nationalism, which is multi-ethnic. And so you have a really quite deep tension as to what kind of political community is generated by the sort of nationalism that you, I think, correctly feel needs to legitimate this kind of framework. And the other issue, which I think goes along a little bit the same line, is that ISIS comes with very much of a non-territorial, non-Westphalian conception of political community. And their challenge to Sykes-Picot is partly those communities were colonial imposed, artificial. Our community corresponds with the sentiments and deep culture of the people living in the region. So they would have to forego that, I think, rather both, I think, a fundamental aspect of their vision, and it is something they share with Al-Qaeda, because Khomeini also had this idea that, Osama bin Laden had this idea that territorial states were an invention of the West, and that the real political community was civilizational and Islamic in his vision. So I think it's important to address these these various ideas of how do you merge these various ideas of political community within this kind of very suggestive framework.
I'm plumping. I'm plumping for ethnic nationalism, not for civic nationalism, the more pluralist version of nationalism that we see maybe in this country. And the reason I'm confident that the ethnic is stronger is because even in the most successful civic nationalisms, like right here in the US, it turns out when you get enough refugees in a short period of time, you begin to see people reacting against them because they're not us. The people whose own forebears were immigrants a couple generations ago are nevertheless ready to say, well, wait a minute, this is a problem. We can't, I mean, maybe we're going to have to cut loose of Texas and New Mexico and all those Hispanic-dominated states that are coming along the road. We can't have people being taught in Spanish. So in that kind of talk and in that kind of political concern, I think you see that at the bottom, ethnic is stronger. And that's why I don't feel bad about plumping for the ethnic over the civic.
So I want to just, first of all, thank you all for your presentations. I want to read you something, Clark. The only viable strategy for Iraq may be to correct the historical defect and move in stages towards a three-state solution, Kurds in the north, Sunnis in the center, Shiites in the south. Les Gelb published that in the New York Times in 2003.
I'm sorry, who did?
Les Gelb, the excellent former president of the Council on Foreign Relations. The reaction against Les's article in the op-ed pages of the New York Times was twofold. One was, do we want to create perverse incentives for organizations or groups or sectarian communities to do horrible things only to be rewarded with statehood? And then the other thing that I would add is what you've described in terms of the Balkanization of this sort of Levantine entity that comprised both Syria and Iraq could create a kind of Weimar Republic feeling among ISIS, which is we've accepted this horrific deal because we were facing this existential crisis, only to eventually find a way to rise again. So you have on the one hand the possibility of creating perverse, like incentives, negative incentives, but on the other hand, the revanchismo that you're trying to prevent may still happen at ever smaller and smaller scales. For some people, the idea of negotiating with Hitler's Germany in the early 1940s would have been anathema. And I think that there are people, although it might be an exaggeration, that would compare ISIS to Hitler in the way that they've treated minorities and the Yazidis and women and Shia.
Not to mention their mass media policy.
Not to mention their mass media policy. But so this is, so I see what you're saying, but this is not the first time that the Balkanization of the region has been discussed, and the success stories that you've mentioned tend to have gone in the other direction, have not been about Balkanization, even in the Balkans, have been about figuring out some mechanism, whether it's through Truth and Reconciliation or through ICT or an ICTR or some sort of international criminal court, that only the top echelons are then prosecuted, but going back together, because at some point, every small group then has these perverse incentives to do horrible things to get the nice reward at the end, which is statehood.
You should have been there to take it up with President Wilson. But this is a genie that's out of the bottle now. I don't think it's time to try to put it back now. So, yes, I see the perverse incentives, although I'd like to point out that, it's often we who pay for the incentives. And to talk politics just for a moment, another topic in which I'm incompetent, there's this great pressure to do something. I mean, right now, the U.S. is sending new military force and new weapons into the middle of this turmoil in Syria and Iraq. So politically, I think it would be possible to substitute for military initiative a diplomatic initiative. So we're still doing something. We're still caring. We're still trying. We haven't just given up on the whole place. Politics is all about moral judgment, as we were starting to talk about earlier. Not so much about rational choice and material things, I think. So, it would help us a lot, I think. It would undermine some of the pressure that, this is a mess and terrible things are happening. And the U.S. is responsible for the world. We got to do something. And the do something in recent history has meant guns and soldiers. So, just politically, if it never had one iota of effect on actually producing boundaries on the ground, I still think it would be good for us.
So this is more of a comment than a question. I'm troubled by the idea of an IS state, so recognized borders. But at the same time, I do think that the idea of exacerbating that cleavage between the globalists and the localists is really interesting. The affiliate or the province model of IS, for me, is something which is much, much more about signaling, about communicating, projecting power than anything else. And there was a series of leaks that I translated back in January 2014, I think it was 6 or 7 months before the caliphate was announced, in which an individual, he calls himself Wiki Baghdadi, he tweets out information which is often very, very interesting and has proven to be correct on a great number of occasions. So, for example, he revealed who Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was. He gave the actual name away. So somehow he's party to these great nuggets. He's also a jihadist in al-Qaeda's camp. But he spoke about the caliphate, the idea of announcing a caliphate 6 months before it happened. He spoke about the details of doing it as well. So going to Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Sinai, the Caucasus, and getting pledges of allegiance on tape beforehand. So then when the statement could be made, when the caliphate could be established, it would look like it was this internationally recognized thing. And this, to cut a long story short, this was all about signaling and projecting power in the conflict, specifically in the conflict context of Syria, in reaction to a coalition of rebel groups, Islamist rebel groups that Baghdadi deemed to be a great threat to ISIS at the time. So the idea of exacerbating that cleavage, I think, is really interesting. And I don't know if there's any other thoughts that you might have on other ways that we might do that without...
I do have an idea. This one, unfortunately, requires a military adventure. You know the name of their magazine, Ibdibir. I never can do these. Dabi. Okay. That's a town up in the northern part of Syria. And militarily, that town is worth nothing. Symbolically, it's worth a lot. So if some military force were to threaten that town, that would exacerbate this conflict inside ISIS.
Did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah. So one way to think about how do you create splits in an organization is to think about sort of what their sort of priorities are, what's their preference ordering in a particular area. And one thing that seems very different to me is that the province groups are aligned with their local communities, right? They're seeking some mixture of goals that's not only ideological. So how do the directives that ISIS leadership is sort of proposing conflict with those objectives? And how do you take actions that promote contradictions at that sort of pivotal spot? There's another thing that I think is really important. One of the things that groups disagree with so often is the targeting of civilians. This is a natural point of contention. We saw this in al-Qaeda, right? We saw it with Zarqawi and the famous letter in 2005 and all of that. But it's not there. It's all over the world. This becomes a point where groups split. It becomes contentious. And if we remember when Zawahiri left Egypt to go join bin Laden's organization, and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad was sort of put out of business, one of the key things that happened there, and that's always in his mind, and why I think that Al-Qaeda is trying to change its strategy some, is this incident where the group is trying to murder I think it's a government minister, it's some official. And instead of that, they get a little girl in a schoolyard. And that just changed the sort of dynamics in the local community support for that organization. It created splits in the organization. And so using those points of contention, and I think that's going to be a lot different for a local entity versus the ideological core and what their priorities are, I think is a good way. If I was writing anti-messaging material, I would play right into that kind of thing.
Thanks, that was very interesting. I'm going to step back from the map table and just ask that if humiliation, which is, I think you said anger plus shame, is kind of the basis of this, is there another way that humiliation could be relieved in this case, apart from ethnic nationalism?
Good question, and I don't have a good answer. There are ways of, because, I mean, in modern psychological understanding of emotion, an emotion starts with an appraisal of something happening in your situation that is relevant in some deep and important way to your welfare, evolutionarily or locally. And so there is research on how you can help people to reappraise a situation, to see it as different. I mean, it's a kind of an offshoot of cognitive therapy. I mean, you could say, well, I mean, to take a well-known example, here is Jesus being humiliated by the soldiers. He's whipped, he's mocked, but he's not humiliated, because his appraisal of the situation is not theirs. So I'm just saying, with an appraisal understanding of what emotions are about, it's possible to help and teach people how to reappraise. But how to do that on a wholesale scale, I don't have the beginnings of an idea how to do that.
I like the idea of thinking about this in this way, and I think John's point that a lot of this is happening in some sense on the ground, and it's a question of whether they take advantage of what's the progress in or however you want to define it. But if you take the point of that you made in terms of the humiliation and shame in terms of the driving force, it also applies to, in fact, some of the realities on the ground now, so that this would imply that, for example, from the Shia point of view in Iraq, the acceptance of losing 2/3 of the country, from the standpoint of all the other parties, both a gain and a loss. And what seems to have happened in many cases in the past, in terms of negotiation, to bring about peace without a complete victory, is that there's a striking out in two ways. There's the schism that everybody seems to want to encourage in certain places, but would also be likely to occur in others, so that there would be violence against each of the likely violence, not definite, but likelihood of violence against each of the parties that were proposing whatever brand of compromise. And then the other part, which was talked about yesterday, in terms of the likely increase in violence by ISIS away from their zone of control, as they got weaker, and that would not necessarily be different from some of the others as well. So as to lashing out against the external and lashing out against the internal, all of that, if it's likely, and given the politics that we've talked about today in terms of how we respond to each of these potential sources of threat, et cetera, it would seem to me it would also require a good deal of preparation on the part of the viewing publics about how much insecurity is potentially in the interim period, whatever that length of period, to be prepared, that it's not going to be perfect on the day after the peace. I know you know that, but I think it's part of that diplomatic solution. It has to include the preparation for response to the likely violence of a different form that will occur.
Remember what Lassa was saying, the people who run the Arhus program, they're worried every day, as I understand it. It would only take one guy coming out of the program doing something really big and horrific, and the political side of this thing would fall apart. And so you got to be preparing all the time, getting people ready for the idea that, you know, nothing's 100% solution, and something's better than nothing 2 times out of. So we got to have this kind of construction that he's already been talking about. It. You have to prepare this kind of way, and yes, I'm agreeing with you then that this is not the only kind of situation in which that kind of preparation is required. But we know something about how to do that if leadership is ready to put some political resources behind it.
One thing you might also consider would be outside, or outsiders. Most of the groups have outside patrons, with Saudi Arabia or the United States or Russia or Iran and so forth. And so if you've got an international, that seems to be sort of happening in Geneva. I mean, it's not working all that wonderfully, but the thing is you'd have Assad would still be there, but you'd be more confident because he'd be controlled sort of by the Russians or by the Iranians or something. And similarly with other groups, you'd have to, no one can control ISIS, so that's, as usual, this outlier. But it seems to be moving, and that's something of that direction. The Hezbollah maybe as well, but certainly many of the Arab Turkey too, obviously. But getting agreement among those groups is not exactly much easier than among the fighting groups. But anyway, you do have, everybody seems to have an interest in stopping the bloody fighting that's going on. And Europe does, obviously, because of the incredible refugees, and so as do Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon. So there is an interest there, a communal interest in just getting this hellhole stopped from being so horrible, even if it's still pretty terrible afterwards. At least they're not killing each other. So you might be able to work out something internationally as a sort of overseer group. I don't know.
Certainly be better if we can avoid something that looks like another colonial imposition. We're gonna make order. We're gonna make order out of this. We'll tell you how it's gonna come out, and here it is. No, I was saying, no, the initiative ought to be, here's a vision, but we're ready to talk about it. We'll talk with everybody. We'll talk with anybody. There's nothing that's off the table. It's all on the table. And I think you're certainly right that without some buy-in from some of the patrons, and I had quite a list of whose interests are at stake there, as they see it anyway. So yeah, without some buy-in, it can't go anywhere. But I mean, that's part of what the initiative has got to take in hand, is to go to the Saudis and say, well, look, you know, we know you care about the Sunni, and look, we want to do something for the Sunni in here. But on the other hand, ... So yes, there's a whole lot of diplomatic. In fact, I think I started off describing it as a diplomatic initiative, something in the war of ideas at the beginning.
I think equally it goes back to the point Risa made, who's going to play God, who's going to play the authority on this one. I think lots of people want to sort of be down in the bottom playing around with it, but I don't think anyone wants to take responsibility for it if it actually comes about. Very interesting ideas to walk away with, and I want to thank both speakers for the presentations.